All right, and we're on. So, hello everybody. We're coming in for this week's next video in the little bit of Irish series that we have out of the 4 that we have planned. So, the past 2 weeks we covered the 1798 Irish Rebellion, and then last week we covered the Great Potato Famine that happened in Ireland, or as the Irish call it, the Great Hunger. And this week we're moving on to the third out of the 4 videos, which is one that's going to take probably just a little longer to really go over, but this is really when Ireland semi gets its independence. I don't say completely, and you'll see why, because they largely get screwed even here by the English, as they always do. And the end of this war is going to unfortunately lead into another war that's going to happen at the very end of this between themselves, which we'll cover next week, which is the Irish Civil War, which arises from a dispute over how this war with Britain is kind of resolved. And it doesn't go over well with everybody, but we'll get to that here at the very end, and we'll lead into that. So for this week's video, we're going to cover the Irish War for Independence, which started in about 1918 and is going to continue until about roughly 1921. The official peace would come in January 1922, but it was over by summer of 21. So this is right at the end of World War I era as well. And in fact, this is kind of a consequence of the World War I era, where democracy is supposedly on the rise, and Britain is also occupied by a war elsewhere, and Ireland kind of sees an opportunity that, the British Empire is distracted right now fighting a war with Germany. We have a prime opportunity to finally break the knot that has bound us to English rule for so long. So and I don't really, for the review here, I don't really think there's a whole lot new. I mean, we've gone over how the numerous injustices that Britain has done to Ireland in the past 2 videos. We've gone over how they took away Catholic land and gave that to Protestant settlers. We've gone over the penal laws that kind of really restricted the civil rights of Catholic native Irishmen and women in society. We've also gone over how the 1798 rebellion has basically tightened the noose of English rule on Ireland. How shortly after that, in about 1800, 1801, Britain merges the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Kingdom of Great Britain and the Kingdom of Ireland into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And we go how that kind of tightens the noose. We've explained how England, even when the Irish were suffering, were still exploiting them, which we saw last week with the Irish potato famine and how many Irishmen and women and children started to immigrate away from their home country just in order to try to survive. So we've gone over a lot of the lead up to this. We've also kind of mentioned at the end of the 1798 rebellion how the desire for independence is not going to go away. And throughout the 19th century, there's going to be a lot of reform movements who are going to really kind of still push that, but they're going to try to find some other methods of getting it done. They're hoping to avoid a large rebellion or violent attack like they were forced to do in 1798. But it's becoming increasingly clear there may be no other option. So throughout the 19th century, it starts to transfer from a desire for outright independence, who the Irish after 1798 now kind of fear even getting that independence because they fear Britain's reaction. They've seen what it has done before. To now the question is, well, if we can't gain full-on independence, what can we have that will at least lessen this British yoke on our lives? And one of the main debates that does come up that we haven't gone much over was the concept of home rule. Home rule is going to come about as an idea in the late 19th century by a lot of Irish Republicans, and even a few British politicians were willing to look into the matter, which the whole idea for home rule was that Ireland should be able to kind of have some more sovereignty than it currently has and be able to take care of its own internal affairs, have its own parliament once again, and be able to kind of rule itself semi-independently, but in the end still owing allegiance to the British Crown. And this was the debate that was starting to change in Irish society come the late 19th century, is you had people that were still diehard independent streakers. They wanted full-on separation, independence from Great Britain, while there's others who are afraid of the possible reaction of Britain to such a move and are more in favor of simply getting home rule granted to them instead of taking the independence route, which they felt that home rule might be more acceptable to the British. And home rule, it's basically they're hoping for something like what Canada has or like Australia has. Not as free as those two, but something close to it, where those countries, even to this day, are still part of the British Commonwealth, still have relations with Britain. The King or Queen of Britain is still their head of state, but they largely run their own affairs. They don't pay any allegiance to Britain other than that. In Ireland at the time, some Irish Republican politicians were hoping for such a move, just to lessen the yoke of British control. And this is going to start to come to a head in the early 20th century. In 1912, as a result of a political deal that came about between the Irish Parliamentary Party and the Liberal Party in the British Parliament. Mind you, this is not in Ireland, because Ireland does not have its own parliament at this point, because they've had that taken away from them. So in the British Parliament in 1912, there comes as part of a political deal that gets introduced by the main Irish party in the English Parliament and the Liberal Party at Westminster, the British government actually introduces a bill onto the floor of Parliament for Irish Home Rule. That this bill would grant Ireland limited autonomy within the United Kingdom, and this was something that had been highly desired by a lot of Irish nationalists. It was not approved, mind you, it was simply put onto the floor, as this is a measure we're going to consider. Now, the bill was opposed, though, by the Ulster Unionists, the people in Northern Ireland, who are kind of formed their own militia called the Ulster Volunteers. Now, you might ask, why would the Ulster people not want to join with home rule idea? Well, the Ulster people, this is where primarily a lot of your Protestant settlers are in Ireland. They do not like the idea of being under home rule because they know that that means the majority of Irish are Catholic. And for once in their greedy little lives, the Protestant landowners in Ulster in Northern Ireland will not be in the dominant governing position. And if home rule is granted, they will be sidelined for the first time in hundreds of years, and they, of course, are opposed to this. The Irish nationalists, by the contrary, they're all for the home rule thing. This is some win for them if they can get it to pass. So they create their own militia to counter the Ulster Volunteers that is called the Irish Volunteers. And they want to ensure that home rule gets passed, contrary to the people in Ulster who are diehard opponents of more autonomy for Ireland because it means less control for them. Now, tensions are going to grow after 1912. What ends up happening with this bill is it never really gets passed. The bill kind of goes into a relapse, and ultimately it does not get passed at all, and home rule is not granted. And why would you say this? Because World War I breaks out. World War I breaks out in August of 1914, so the Home Rule Bill kind of gets sidelined because now Britain is in the middle of a war. It isn't going to consider home rule when it's in the middle of a war to defend its empire, as it views, its sovereignty. And home rule kind of gets put on the side table, and the British government says, we will consider this. We will come back to this matter once the war is over. We are not going to take a position or consideration of this while we're actively fighting a war because we need to focus on defending the empire. And this is what they plan to do. Now, Ireland, the Irish, rightfully so, are not interested in defending the British Empire. And for most of the war, although the British were conscripting soldiers, they largely left Irish men and women, no, well, not women, but they largely left Ireland as a whole, meaning Irish men, out of conscription service. They did not force Irish people into conscription. They took volunteers, and there were some Irish men that did decide to volunteer to serve in the British Army in World War I and did serve in many of the battles, most notably some at the campaign in Gallipoli at Settle Bar on the Cape Helles landing. But Unfortunately, the majority of the Irish opinion is not for really fighting for the British Empire because they view that they're victims as anybody else, so they don't want to fight. However, the suspension of any consideration of the Home Rule Bill is going to kind of increase the tension because the Irish volunteers, they want an answer now because they're getting sick of waiting for either Britain to grant something or do we need to take action on our own. So this ends up causing a split within that organization of those who are willing to wait and support the war effort for Britain, who say, well, if we support Britain in its war effort, they'll be more likely to give us home rule in the end. While the other end of the Irish volunteers says, absolutely not. It won't change anything if we support them or if we don't support them. They're not going to grant us this because they're already sidelining it. They don't see it as an issue of importance. And after the war, they'll just have every reason to probably deny it because the British Empire will only probably gain in power if it wins. So that other branch, that negative branch of the Irish volunteers who are not in favor of supporting the British war effort in World War I, they become much more radical as a result of this, and they decide we're going to take matters into our own hands. And in April of 1916, this culminates in a very, very famous event that is going to be known as the Easter Rising, which many people may have heard of, and it was an absolute short-lived rebellion slash uprising against British authority in Ireland. And this happens in around Easter of 1916, so in April. And the Irish volunteers end up it was a little bit across Ireland, but the main events occurred in the, of course, nominal capital city. I mean, it's not really the capital city, at least at this point, but we're going to say that it is. But it's going to happen in Dublin. Dublin is the main center of the events of the Easter Uprising. And this is going to see the Irish volunteer rebels are going to proclaim Ireland is no longer a part of the British Empire. They actually issue a proclamation signed with 7 names, and they declare that Ireland is no longer part of the British Empire. We are now an Irish republic that has been founded. And home rule was not enough for them. They wanted complete independence from Britain, and they are going to use military force if needed to accomplish this. And this is exactly what happens with the Easter Uprising. Several of the rebels spread throughout Dublin. They seize important buildings and other places throughout the town, most notably the General Post Office down in downtown Dublin. And that actually acts as their headquarters during this uprising, and they try to actually seize control of the city. Now, the rebellion ends up being put down within a week by the British Army, who sends in many more troops to put this down, and there are about 500 deaths. Now, Britain's response to the Easter Uprising is to squash it, because they view that we're at war. I cannot afford you to be uprising in my backyard when I got a war effort going on in France. And there were British people who believed that maybe perhaps these Irish rebels were being assisted by Germany as an attempt. And there were talks between the two parties for assistance, and I do believe Germany may have supplied some weapons, but ultimately there was no military assistance other than that, and they were not working in collusion with the German government at the time. But Britain puts this down very violently. About 500 end up being killed, and at first, Irish public opinion is not negative on the British to the reaction to the Easter Uprising. They're hopeful, but at the same time, they remember the lessons of 1798 and what had happened there. What turns the public against the British is the British government's reaction to the Easter Uprising. Instead of, maybe trying to get to the source of the problem and figure out why these rebels rebelled the way they did, what caused them to use violence, what have we done that could better the situation and prevent this from happening again, instead of being a little bit self-reflective and seeing what the British could do that had brought the Irish to this point, their reaction and response was that of brute force. They rounded up the 7 men who had signed the proclamation and a couple others as well that had been ringleaders of this uprising, and they all sentenced them to execution, and they were executed by firing squad. And some of the members were executed quite brutally. One, I remember, I believe it was James Connolly, he had been badly wounded in the uprising. He probably would have died within a week. And instead of, just letting his wounds kind of carry themselves out and let him die, peacefully, they had the audacity to tie this man up in a chair and still shoot him as part of a firing squad execution. And the 7 men who were part of the Easter Uprising, I think we ought to go over their names just so people are aware who they were, because if you go to Ireland, these people are considered to be national heroes to this day, even though they all pretty much paid for it with their lives. But I believe it's important that we see their names at least, because these are considered to be your main Irish patriots. And one of them, let's see here, we had Sean McDermott, I'm trying to pronounce names here, Thomas Clark, P.H. Pierce, James Connolly, Thomas McDonough, Amon, I can't even pronounce his last name, Siant, I'm sure someone can probably correct that, Amon Siant is how I'm seeing it, but I'm sure it's pronounced different in Irish. And then I have Joseph Plunkett. These were your 7 men that end up being the ringleaders who are brutally executed by firing squad. And instead of the British hope that this would quell any sense of further rebellion in Ireland, the execution of the Easter Uprising leaders actually only makes the Irish public even more resentful to British rule. And this actually has the unintended effect of giving the rebels a posthumous victory by inflaming the tensions between the Irish and their British masters, and finally getting the rest of the Irish public to kind of get to the point that they're willing to fight for their independence. So this has, in a way, the rebels do win a victory here. Unfortunately, it's after their deaths. It changes Irish public opinion. The British had also gone ahead to arrest about 3,000 nationalist activists as well, and this only further inflamed the tensions that were coming about. I think I have one here. Where is it? No, we don't want that. This right here is actually a picture of Dublin. It's actually at the post office here that was the hold-up headquarters of the Irish Volunteer Rebels during the Easter Rising in 1916. And you can just kind of see the rubble and devastation of the building. The British had a firing squad up in front keeping fire with rifles, but they were also firing artillery rounds at this post office building where the rebels were holed up inside. The rebels didn't have artillery, as far as I know. It was mostly the British who just decided, yeah, we'll shell the building. And you can kind of see the building's burnt out. The floors are gone. And this building is still there in Dublin today. You can actually go see it, and I've been told there's still bullet holes in the wall. But this is the aftermath of the Easter Uprising at that particular part of town where a lot of the major events had occurred. Now, British politicians in Parliament have a little bit of a different response to that of the British military. They realize that the response that had been done in response to this uprising between 1916 and the following year in 1917 had actually kind of galvanized Irish opinion of the British government, and they realized, okay, we cannot keep doing this because we're actually making the situation worse. So in late 1917, they decide that all remaining prisoners who have been arrested in association with the Easter Rising, which is roughly that 3,000 men that they've arrested, release them out of the prison. Let them go, and we're going to restart negotiations for home rule to possibly get that passed. Maybe that will quell Irish dissent. Unfortunately, the released prisoners that get released are part of the Irish political party of Sinn Féin. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, Sinn Féin. And the Sinn Féin or Sinn Féin party is very much for an independent Ireland. Many of these people that you just released are now free to vote. And there is an election coming up in 1918 that's going to determine kind of where Ireland is going to go. And the turning point that's going to really turn Irish public opinion once and for all against the British is in early 1918 when the Kaiserschlacht offensive gets launched by Germany on the Western Front. As a result, Britain's line is broken on the Western Front, and there is a threat that the British Army could collapse with this newly attacking German force that is much larger in size because Russia has exited the war. Britain is desperate for reinforcements to reinforce its front lines, and they finally break what they have not done for the previous 4 years and decide, okay, we're introducing conscription to Ireland. We need the troops. And this infuriates the whole island because many of them do not want to fight for Britain. Many of them have no intention of going to war and would rather go to prison than serve out their conscription service. And this has the opposite effect, and it's the final straw in many Irish eyes. They've said, okay, some of us have sat here and be quiet, and then we watch you murder our rebel leaders because they're trying to fight for what we all believe in. We've watched you now you're conscripting our sons and our men so that they can go fight in your war, not ours, and we have no interest in it anymore. We want nothing to do with you. We're sick of this. And it shows throughout the population. And this is going to follow with the election. There's riots that start breaking out across the country. You have confrontations that start breaking out between the Sinn Féin Irish Volunteers, because you have Irish volunteers that are part of their political party, and you have the Royal Irish Constabulary, that is a branch of the British Army who's been there since about 1822, I want to believe, or a little earlier, and they're kind of the branch of the British military in Ireland charged with keeping order. So now you got riots breaking out, you got attacks coming out on the British military establishments in Ireland. The situation is getting much more out of hand. And then the general election comes up that fall in 1918, with World War I mostly over at this point, and Sinn Féin has perhaps the largest showing it's ever had in Irish politics up to that point. And it scares the crap out of Britain, because in the fall 1918 elections, Sinn Féin candidates lead in many of the political fields in Ireland, and they take most of the vote, with the exception of some of the northern areas. And in fact, Britain had kind of had heads up that this was going to happen. They had heads up that Sinn Féin was leading in a lot of the polls. So in an effort to try to stop Sinn Féin from gaining any kind of majority political power in Ireland, they decide, we're going to try to stifle support. We're going to arrest your supporters. We're going to put them on charges of conspiring with Germany. We're going to do everything that we possibly can to influence the outcome of this election. Sounds like direct election interference, contrary to what a lot of people want to think now. But in this case, Britain is trying to change the outcome of an election that they know is probably going to go bad for them. So they're arresting people that are supporters of Sinn Féin politicians. They're detaining even some politicians and putting them on trumped-up charges so that way they can't continue to run, or at least they don't think they'll be able to run, and try to keep them out of office. It ultimately does not help Britain, because in December of that year, in 1918, Sinn Féin decisively wins the Irish vote. They win with over 69% of the seats, of the Irish seats in Parliament. They gain 73 out of 105 seats. That's actually quite big. And I do have, if I can find where I placed it here. Ah, there it is. I do have a map in this book that will kind of show you guys the election map. So all the green counties here are the ones that went for Sinn Féin in 1918. The purple are the ones that they didn't. I believe the yellow ones as well. Yes. So as you can see, they win most of Ireland. The only part of Ireland that the Sinn Féin, nationalist Sinn Féin party does not gain is this northern area where the Protestants are. That is the only part, with the exception of this county up here, which I believe was Donegal County. But yeah, they win a good majority of Ireland, especially down south, overwhelmingly this dark green. But this scares the crap out of the British, because they realize Irish people are going full nationalistic now. There is no compromising with them in some ways, because they're dead set. They've had enough. They want independence, and we're going to fight for it. We're willing to elect a party into the Irish delegation in Parliament that will express our views, support our viewpoints, and be more than willing to vote for home rule. if something worse. Now, this is going to lead to the first Dáil being set up in January of 1919, and this is where the war is about to start. Until now, it's been small attacks, small riots, small arguing. It's nothing been like full-on warfare. In 1919, this is going to change, because now, with the first Dáil making its debut, Sinn Féin declares Ireland to be an Irish republic, much like the Irish Volunteers had done 3 years earlier in 1916. And they declare, we are no longer under British authority. So, from the get-go, Britain's worst fears come to light, because as soon as the Sinn Féin government takes power, they establish their own Parliament for Ireland, the Dáil, which they still have, the first Dáil, and they decide, you know what, we're going to pronounce it right from the outright. We're done with you. We're our own thing now. We're our own republic. We're no longer part of you, so either leave or we'll fight. Now, still, nobody initially expects a war to break out, because Britain is still recovering from World War I. They would think that, well, Britain's going to be too tired of war, they won't really mount a major campaign. They'd be more willing to try to negotiate right now than they'd be willing to go to war. They're exhausted. They fought a 4-year-long war against an enemy that was just as good as they were in many respects, if not better. But several events are soon going to transpire that turn the Dáil's proclamation of an Irish republic from just a proclamation and a diplomatic crisis to a full-on conflict. On the same day that the first Dáil ended up meeting in Dublin, 2 of the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC as we'll call them, just to shorten it. We'll call them the RIC. The RIC constables were shot dead by Irish volunteers in Tipperary on the very same day that the first Dáil is being holding its session and declaring that it's no longer independent. 2 RIC constables are shot dead in the province of Tipperary, and the Irish volunteers that had done this also managed to seize explosives from the British military warehouses, and these ended up being the opening shots of the war, because to the British government, it was one thing for you to declare independence from us after an election. It was another where at the same time you're declaring independence, at least to the British eyes, it seemed awfully conspicuous that 2 of our agents end up getting shot dead while you're declaring it. And this sparks Britain to say, okay, Ireland is in full-on rebellion, again, and we're just going to crush it like we did last time in 1798. So this ain't going to be much different, at least in their eyes. In Dublin, the Dáil prepares its own war effort. They realize, okay, war's coming. Britain is not going to react pleasantly to this. We need to be prepared to fight and defend this government that we're setting up. So in Dublin, Michael Collins, as many from Ireland probably know that name, and some from outside of Ireland probably know that name, he becomes a major military leader during the Irish War for Independence and lasting into the Irish Civil War. That's going to end up with his tragic death. But Michael Collins, who is a member of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, he becomes Director of Intelligence, and he ends up forming a squad of people. I'm rearranging my notes here so it's a little easier for me to see. But Michael Collins ends up arranging a squad of people who are going to work to assassinate any detectives who are coordinated with the arrest of Republican activists. So his job is to be a head of an organization set up by the Dáil, that your job is to go find out who these people are who are working with the British that are working to assassinate these Republican activists and detain them in some cases. And once you do find out who they are, who these contacts are that are working with the British government and the RIC, assassinate them. Get rid of them. They're a threat. Now, in late 1919, Collins and his squad attempt to kill John French, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. And this is only going to escalate tensions further. John French had actually been a very notable general during the opening months of World War I. He had led the British Expeditionary Force to France in August of 1914 when war had first broke out, and actually helped to beat the British back at the First Battle of not the British, but the Germans at the First Battle of the Marne. And so he's a very notorious British general who's in charge of being Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. He's the king's man in Ireland. And they have now attempted to make an assassination attempt on this very high-profile British government figure. That is going to inflame the British government even further. The limited resistance that was being put up by the Irish at this point, because they weren't seeing a large-scale British invasion yet, was basically passive. It wasn't full-on, absolute warfare from the get-go. They did it hit and run. Hit and run tactics. We're going to find specific targets who are valuable to the British government, and we're going to hit them, assassinate them, and hopefully this will convince Britain to just back off, or if they do decide to go to full-on war with us, we're going to go ahead and we'll have half their leaders assassinated, and they'll be very uncoordinated when they're invading Ireland, when they're sending the troops and everything, because their commanders will be dead. Their high-profile officers and that will also be dead. And the Irish people end up not just offering military resistance to British rule, but even in about every place that they can go. Women stay at home, try to make things of themselves. They boycott British goods. Hunger strikes end up being struck up in prisons by prisoners. The prisoners refuse to eat, even though the British guards and everything else are trying to feed them. The Irish prisoners are trying to do their part and saying, nope, we're going to show the world what you are, and if you want to make us eat, you're going to have to force feed us. They also boycott railways that are carrying British troops. The railway workers, they stop working. If the railway is carrying British troops into Ireland, we're not working on it. We will not go to our jobs if you're hauling British troops on this railway. In rural areas, even small farmers are trying to seize parts of large ranches dominated by those Protestant settlers, by those British officials. They're trying to seize land. So about everybody is offering resistance that can in any way that they can. The prisoners, hunger strikes. Women, boycotting British goods. Railway workers, we're not going to work on our jobs if it's going to haul British troops to and from Ireland. And even farmers, we're going to try to seize land. Everyone is offering resistance, and this is going to intensify the violence that is going to take full effect in 1920. 1919 is the start, but everything gets worse in 1920. Because by early 1920, most of Sinn Féin's political leadership is being arrested by the British government because they see them as an absolute threat to British rule. They're instigating rebellion, and they actually have the names of the people because they're in the Irish government. So they know who they are, they know who they're looking for. All right, you're under arrest. So by early 1920, most of Sinn Féin, their political leadership is all in prisons. One of the few that manages to escape was I can't remember if he was president of the Dáil or not, but it was Éamon de Valera. And he's kind of a controversial figure in Irish politics, and we'll see that a little bit more so with the next video in the Irish Civil War. But Éamon de Valera, he actually had been a member of the leadership a little bit of the Easter Uprising. He had originally been scheduled to be executed along with the other leaders at the time, but he had also been born in New York City, so he was an American citizen. And that might have been part of the reason why Britain ultimately commuted his sentence and backed off from executing him, was because of the complications that if you kill him, you're also killing a U.S. citizen, and that could cause complications with the United States. So Britain ultimately commuted his sentence and did not execute him, and now he's a leader of the Sinn Féin political party and is trying to aid in this rebellion against British rule. Now, Valera ends up being one of the few who does not get arrested, and the only reason he isn't arrested is because he actually flees the country and goes back home to the United States and tries to drum up support in the U.S. for Ireland's cause. He actually hopes to meet with the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson and hope to maybe get his support to try to get him to back Irish independence from Britain as well, which ultimately is unsuccessful as it is. But this leaves, back at home, with Valera gone and the other leadership being imprisoned, this leaves your military leaders, Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy, or how you say his name, they are in charge at home. So the military leaders, like Michael Collins, they're in charge. The political leaders are all arrested. Valera is out of the country. They're in charge of this rebellion and making sure that it hopefully is successful. So Collins and his buddies, they're going to order all Irish volunteer units and all IRA units. You are to raid the RIC barracks for arms. Wherever they have barracks, they have guns. Take the guns. Take the weapons. We'll need them. So the Dáil starts endorsing this campaign formally in the spring of 1921, but in 1920, it's largely just the IRA that is doing this on its own. They don't have formal backing from the Dáil because most of their leaders are imprisoned. But this was also opposed by some Sinn Féin members as being too violent because they argued this is just going to escalate things further. Now you're stealing weapons away from them, you're stealing guns, you're stealing grenades, you're stealing ammo, you're asking for further conflict. And the IRC is not just going to have its weapons stolen from it, but when they go out into the rural areas, the police stations of the IRC are starting to be attacked by Irish volunteer members and Irish volunteer raids. So at this point, the IRC goes into full scale war mode with the Irish volunteers. But it's not a regular war. It's a guerrilla war. It's a hit and run. We're raiding, we're getting supplies, we're killing specific targets, and then we're rushing back to our little headquarters and trying to hide out there. We're not trying to do an overall massive war effort from the get-go. What's worse, and what makes things worse, is after the IRA would capture these police stations and vacate them out and evacuate them and take all that there was in need of in there, any weapons or ammo or anything of value, they would burn the police stations to try to enforce their will upon the land, to try to make sure that the police weren't able to just, go back in and start doing their jobs again. No, we're going to burn your places of operation so you have nowhere to operate from. And on Easter Sunday night, 1920, this is when it actually began because the IRA would start burning them systematically from here on out after Easter Sunday of 1920. By the summer of 1920, many of the IRC men are resigning their commissions and getting out of the Royal Irish Constabulary because they view that the IRA is it's overwhelming. They're not getting any help from the British government. I mean, they are the British military arm in Ireland, but they're telling the British government, we need help. We're getting overwhelmed. We can't handle these rebels. They're getting too powerful. And since they don't get any help, a lot of them said, you know what? I'm done with this. They want a united Ireland. They want to be free of British rule. Let them be free because I'm not messing with it anymore. I'm not getting myself killed. So come summer, the IRC's ranks start to deplete because a lot of the people they've had enough and they start resigning their commissions in the IRC to get out. This allows the IRA, in the absence of any major IRC, control, now they're seizing power in this power vacuum. So the IRA is actually starting to gain large control over Ireland. Unfortunately, as they seize control, the IRC members that are still there, they start adopting guerrilla tactics as well. They start assassinating major IRA members that they can manage to locate and kind of pick out one by one. Such as one of them that they really hit, that was a major hit, was Thomas McCartan, who was the mayor of Cork. He was a major IRA supporter, and the IRC members ended up assassinating him since he was a prominent Irish Republican. In the summer of 1920, Sinn Féin ends up winning the local government elections across Ireland, and they actually take over the functions of government, such as law enforcement and tax enforcement. And now Britain's really going to be pissed, to put it blankly, because now the IRA is in almost full control of Ireland. They're in charge of taxing the people. They're in charge of law enforcement. Well, I can guarantee you, since they consider themselves to be an Irish republic, the IRA is not having a law enforcement that's upholding British laws. And the tax enforcement, well, that tax money is certainly not going to the crown. It's going to the Irish government. So now Britain isn't getting money. That's a first. So in this point, Britain is on the losing end. of the Irish War for Independence. At this point, the IRA is slowly taking over the functions of the IRC in Ireland. They're taking over the functions of the British government in Ireland. At this point, Britain's control is slipping drastically. And they even managed to replace the British court system with Sinn Féin and Dáil courts. They end up replacing the British court system as well. So they're changing Ireland to be Irish, not under British control. And this scares the crap out of Britain. So as British control is slipping, the British are now officially considering Ireland is an insurgent state, and the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and his government, they are finally actually starting to take some action. They propose an autonomous government in Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. They think, well, maybe if we split the Catholics and the Protestants apart, maybe this will stop the unrest, and we can preserve British control. That's not going to work. But the British believe so anyway. And the British are also going to deploy perhaps one of the most notorious people of the war. And this was the new corps of paramilitary police to try to keep order and that were operated and were loyal to the British government, veterans mostly from the First World War, that their official name was the Auxiliary Division of the RIC Auxiliary Division, but the name that would be given to them most famously by the Irish Republicans and the IRA and the Dáil was the Black and Tans, mostly named for their black and brown uniforms that these veterans would wear. And the Black and Tans are mostly veterans of World War I, and part of the reason they become so notorious is they have a very high record of police brutality. They attack civilians for reprisals against any civilian, and when the Irish Republicans in the field are doing something, they take it out on the civilian population. They use every sense of police brutality on innocents just to get a point through and hopefully scare off the Irish Republicans, which fails, and this is part of the reason why they're so hated. Now, the British Parliament, passed a Restoration of Order in Ireland Act, which was giving special powers to the police and the military in Ireland to try to regain British control. This leads to the massive escalation that's going to take place for the remainder of the war. The British response marks this massive escalation. Now, the British forces, they're going to carry out reprisals on civilians for every attack by the IRA. So now, they're warning the IRA, continue doing what you're doing. Kill our officers, kill our leadership, kill whoever you want. But every time you do this, there's going to be a cost. And that cost is we're going to be hitting your homes, we're going to be hitting your neighborhoods, and we're going to be hitting your families. So go ahead, kill our men, because we'll kill yours. And they start doing this. And this is part of the reason that I say Britain went overboard during the War for Independence. I'm not saying the Irish Republicans were entirely, hands clean and free. The Irish Republicans, by large fault, had engaged in very similar activity at similar points. They would find the family members of Black and Tan auxiliaries. They would find, members of the Royal RIC or the Black and Tans who were surrendering and execute them anyway. They wouldn't give them any kind of freedom. They wouldn't give them any kind of mercy or rights of surrendering. They would engage in their own atrocities, is my point. But the British, by and large, are targeting civilians specifically as reprisals for the Irish fighting the British military. That takes it a step too far, in my opinion. So, in order to try to enforce British rule in Ireland and squabble this dissent and try to get it extinguished, we're going to start committing attacks on civilian populations, and we're even going to start slaughtering civilians. We're going to start getting them in groups and doing firing squads. We're going to burn your homes. We're going to burn your villages. And there's about 17 deaths in 1919 from IRA hands. And those 17 deaths is going to warrant you burning villages, killing people in groups, killing homes, destroying homes, robbing them at point blank. For 17 people dead? Really? It's not even worth it. Now, the IRA ends up responding to the British newfound atrocities and British attacks by forming what they call full-time flying columns. These are going to be fully, these are going to be full-on military-style regiments who are going to engage in ruthless guerrilla warfare 24/7 for every time that the British are doing these atrocities. Some of the cities that suffer the worst in violence end up being Belfast, Derry, and Lisburn are going to suffer severe riots, and after 2 northern Protestant police officers are killed by the IRA, it only gets worse. Loyalists end up being attacked in Catholic areas because the Catholics, they're the ones being oppressed at this point. The Black and Tans are coming after them, even if they're not engaged with the Irish Republicans. So at this point, start attacking the Loyalists, because who do you think these people have been sent here to defend, and who do you think is siding with the British? This leads to over 100 more killed in just those cities alone. Others flee after the Catholic homes end up being burnt. And about 7,000 Catholics actually end up being expelled during this time period from the Belfast shipping yards, which brings the shipping industry in Belfast, which used to be the biggest industry in the city. This was the same industry that spawned the Titanic. They end up going out of business and out of work for a time because their people end up fleeing. Most of the workers in the shipyards were Catholic Irishmen, and about 7,000 of them end up being expelled from their jobs. Northern Ireland authorities end up forming what they call the Ulster Special Constabulary as a armed unionist police force to try to back up the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Black and Tans. And the autumn and winter of 1920, this is going to see new levels of ruthlessness on both sides, because now we have local Unionists are banding together, local Irish nationalists have banded together, and they also have the British Army in the fray in there as well. And they're all just, it's a mess of violence. They're killing each other every which way they possibly can. Anytime they encounter each other or trying to hurt the other, to try to get the other to either back off or see what they're going to do next. And on November 21st, 1920, the IRA units in Dublin ended up assassinating 14 British intelligence officers. As a revenge, this was tit for tat. So first, IRA is going to murder 14 intelligence officers. Immediately following that, the IRC Black and Tans shot 15 civilians dead at a football match on the same very day. As soon as I got word that you just shot 14 officers, just go to a peaceful football game on a Sunday afternoon, took 15 civilians out of the crowd, and shot them in front of everybody. 17 Black and Tans were then killed in a week later at an IRA ambush in Cork. As a result, as backlash, the British Royal Forces end up proceeding to set fire to the Cork city centre as retaliation. That one's a little excessive in my mind. 17 people dead, and you decide that your best solution is to burn homes and burn a whole quarter of the city? Really? This leads to another 500 being killed by December of 1920, and talks of a truce end up being halted because the British are insisting that the IRA has to be the first one to lay down its arms. There's talks of a truce. The Dáil is trying to negotiate with Britain, saying, we don't want this violence any more than you do, but you're forcing it upon us. And Britain's saying at the same time, well, we're more than willing to take a truce with you, but you're going to have to lay down your arms first. And Ireland's saying, okay, that's not coming about because we don't trust you. You're literally burning our homes and killing our wives and children. Why would we back down, be the first to back down when you're the one being on the losing end here? And then Britain's changing it and saying, well, no, you're on the losing end. It's just back and forth. So the negotiations go nowhere. I do believe I have... yes. I actually have pictures here of some of these figures that we've discussed. So this is going to be Michael Collins, who's one of the main heads of the IRA during the War for Independence. He ends up losing his life in the Civil War, which we'll discuss next week. But he was a major military leader during the time of the Irish Republican forces during the War for Independence against Great Britain. He was relatively young. I think he was only in his late 20s, early 30s. If I remember right, I think he died at 31. Here we have Eamon de Valera, who is going to actually later in life be president, I believe, of Ireland, or at least their prime minister, and he actually lives until the 1960s, but he kind of becomes a controversial figure and partly for his reaction to the Irish Civil War that's going to come about. But during the War for Independence, he's very much on the side of the Irish Republicans. He actually met with John F. Kennedy, I believe, when he came over in the 60s. Here we have a picture of a group of, I'll be damned, a group of black and tans. And you can kind of see where they get their uniform name. Because you can see here, black and brown tan looking uniforms. This is where they got their name at. And this is after a IRA attack on a local business in Northern Ireland. So these black and tan members probably just either killed a bunch of IRA members or got there after the fact. I'm hoping it was the latter. You can even see the one window. I don't know if you can see it real well, but the one window actually has a hole in it, in the window. But these were veterans of World War I who Britain in the British Army who had been conscripted to come over to Ireland and kind of back up the Royal Irish Constabulary and trying to suppress this rebellion that was occurring in Ireland, this insurgency. And by contrast, here is a group of an IRA battalion. I think this was the 3rd Tipperary Battalion, I believe, of the IRA. These are just local Irishmen who took up guns and arms to try to gain independence on their own, but this was the main forces that they had at their disposal. And then here is a picture of how we just mentioned that after several civilians, well, not civilians, but how several RIC members have been shot in Cork, about 14 of them have been shot in Cork, that 17 of them, 17 black and tans, or RIC members, have been killed a week in December 1920 in an IRA ambush in Cork, and then the not the IRA, this is old, ugh. After those 17 have been killed in Cork, the black and tan set fire to the center of City Cork, and this is a picture of the center of Cork after that fire had actually come about. It's just charred, ruined buildings. And they did this not just to Cork, but there were other cities as well. Munster, I believe, was another province that had a lot of burnings in it, and Leinster. So during the first 6 months of 1921, this is really the final months of the conflict. This is going to see about 1,000 more people end up being killed in fighting. That's going to go off and on. This is guerrilla warfare. There's not really, and that's what makes this a different war. There's not really a whole lot of major battles like we would see in a regular war. But it's hit and run raids. It's tit for tat. One side would attack, the other one would attack. There's not much more to go on beyond that in a lot of ways. There's not a big grand military confrontation that is going to be the decisive factor. And it's kind of like Vietnam in some ways. I mean, no side is really winning. It's just a stalemate. It's just a matter of who is going to last the longest. And for the first 6 months of 1921, you see 1,000 more people end up being killed. Most intense violence was going to be in Dublin, South Munster, and Belfast. And County Cork alone, 500 dead, and Dublin another 300 dead in just 6 months alone, with 6,000 Republicans being imprisoned. It's getting, the bloodletting is going on. And one side is eventually going to have to accept this is not a winnable situation. Now, in martial law, the British ended up declaring martial law in Munster province as the regular British army, who now at this point is also backing up the IRC and the Black and Tans, they start performing what they call sweeps through the countryside, while officials are going to begin house burnings and executions in response to any IRA attacks. The IRA is going to respond to this. They're now going to step up the shootings of informers, but now they're also going to include off-duty British personnel and burned property of loyalists as well. So as a consequence to them regularly going on these burnings, now even if you're an off-duty British officer, you are a valid military target, and we're also going to burn the property of the loyalists who we've largely kind of left out of this. When the British began shooting prisoners, the IRA would follow by shooting captured British soldiers and police. So it was Again, tit for tat. You're going to start shooting our men, we'll start shooting yours. By the summer of 1921, the IRA was low on ammunition and weapons, and many of their fighters had been imprisoned. And Britain, at this point, was trying to claim victory was at hand, but they continued the guerrilla activity with bombs, meant that there was not going to be an immediate end in sight. So this is kind of a situation of Vietnam, which hasn't even happened yet. If we remember, the American government during Vietnam was telling the American public at home, oh, yeah, well, I mean, victory's so close. We have the commies on the run, and, we're going to be having this war over here real soon. And then it just dragged on and on and on. Oh, and on. Until eventually, the government had to finally come out and say, yeah, we've been blowing smoke up your butt. We've been blowing smoke. But it's the same thing here. The British government is telling the public in the world, yeah, this is going to end real soon. We're going to have this over. I mean, the IRA is running out of military. They're running out of men. I mean, this ain't going to end anytime. This is going to end real soon. And then the next week, bomb. Next week after that, bomb. Next week after that, bomb. It just goes on. The people see this, and they really start to realize, yeah, this ain't ending anytime soon. This is just going to keep going, because even without a major military force to counter the RIC, the IRA is just going to do these hit and run, almost terrorist attacks, just to still get back at you in some form or manner. And the British government starts realizing this. They realize this ain't going anywhere, because the RIC, the Black and Tans, the British Army, they're trying their best, and they're still having attacks happen. There's nothing that can be done to get a military win. The fighting is abruptly going to stop on July 11th of 1921. And this is going to be because there ends up being a truce that is negotiated between the British and Irish Republican forces to formally do the end to the fighting until an actual peace can be made. So it's not a formal peace, but a truce, like an armistice that had ended World War I, saying, okay, for right now, let's stop fighting, and we're going to see if we can get a peace done here, because we're exhausted, you're running out of men, we don't have any interest in doing this anymore. Let's see if we can finally get to some kind of common bargaining position at this point. This is when the political settlement talks start beginning. So at this point, by July 11, 1921, we're finally got to the point that Britain is finally coming to the negotiating table a little bit and saying, all right, let's talk, because this has been dragging on for 3 years pretty much now. I mean, we just got out of World War I. We don't want to fight anymore. We're exhausted with war at this point. The British public is exhausted with war. And I mean, they come out of World War I, and now you're telling us now we got to go fight this war in Ireland. The British people are like, no, like if they want to go away so badly, let them go. Like, we're tired of war. We've been fighting war. I mean, this is 1921 for 8 years. We're sick of it. So this brings us to the political settlement that's going to not only end the Irish War for Independence, but it's going to set up what we're going to talk about next week, which is the Irish Civil War. And that is the truce and the treaty. Now, the truce that is negotiated in July of 1921 allows the IRA to regroup, recruit more men, and train openly without having to fear British reprisals or Black and Tan reprisals or RIC reprisals. So they're thinking a truce is going to be temporary. Because let's be honest, we all are thinking what the IRA is thinking. Britain's never going to hold its word. They're never going to willingly come to the bargaining table and actually come to an acceptable peace. So the IRA, throughout the remainder of 1921, is pretty much working on building up its forces again in anticipation that this truce is going to be temporary and there's going to be a resumption of the violence. So we need to be ready for that. We need to recruit more men. We need to get more training done. We need to get more supplies in before this starts up again. Shockingly, to everyone's astonishment, in December of that year, in 1921, an Irish delegation led by Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith, who was a member of the Dáil, they actually signed an Anglo-Irish Treaty. A treaty is actually managed to come about. This, unfortunately, is going to de-establish the Irish Republic that had been proclaimed in January of 1919. The Irish Republic that the Dáil was a representative of was no longer a thing. Instead, what the British were willing to grant was an Irish Free State, as they called it, which would incorporate 26 of Ireland's 32 counties. Would be in this new Irish Free State that would have largely its own home rule. It would have actually better home rule that had been proposed in the original 1912 bill, and be able to largely govern its own affairs. Unfortunately, they were still supposed to be subservient to the British Crown, so they basically were willing to give Ireland the status of something like Canada or New Zealand or Australia, something along those lines, but not full-on independence. Now, what is the drawing line out of this, unfortunately, is the British are adamant in this treaty, and during the negotiations, in fact, they are not willing to let all of Ireland go because they know that Northern Ireland did not go for Sinn Féin and is more than loyal to the British cause, of the regions around Belfast and Ulster. So they actually make it a requirement in this treaty that the Irish Republicans don't have much left other than to agree to, is that the 6 remaining counties that are not automatically going to be part of the Irish Free State may choose for themselves whether or not they wish to join or if they want to remain under British rule. And every one of those 6 counties ends up sticking with British rule, which forms Northern Ireland. This is where the partition of Ireland comes about, is in 1921, when Britain says that the 6 northern counties, they're still loyal to us, they wish to remain, and we're going to keep them. You can have the other 26 counties, but we're still going to have that little foothold in the north. So I'm going to show you what that looks like in case anyone's not familiar with a modern map of Ireland. So this is what that looks like to this day. You have all the green counties. These are the Irish Free State. This is now its own semi-independent country that's just part of the British Commonwealth and British Empire still, like Canada or Australia, up until the late 1930s. These 6 counties in white, this is Northern Ireland that decides they don't want to join the rest of the Free State because these are Protestant and the rest of them are Catholic. They don't want to be part of a Catholic nation. So they decide, no, we're going to stay with Britain. We like it here. That ticks off the Irish Republicans here. They wanted all of Ireland united, not this little partition part that Britain sneakily took away from them. They did not want that, and that has been a source of conflict for well over 100 years. And this is what really ticks off a lot of Irish nationalists who were part of the IRA. They're unhappy with the treaty because they don't like the fact that it partitions Ireland, and they don't like the fact that they're still having to be subservient to the British monarchy and the British government. But the other Irish Republicans, they're saying, we got to take it. Like Michael Collins, surprisingly, is in favor of taking the treaty. He's pro-treaty because he argues it may not be the best outcome, but it's better than what we were being offered before this started, and it's a place to start. He said it may not give us full independence now, but it provides us at least the foundation to achieve it. It may not grant it right now, but it's better than nothing. And if we work well at this, eventually we can probably achieve that full independence. And they did. By the late 1930s, I think it was like 1937, Ireland, the Irish Free State fully broke away from the British Commonwealth and was the Republic of Ireland. At that point, they were fully separated from Great Britain. So it wasn't long. I mean, this is 1920. That's roughly not even 20 years later. But this is going to split the IRA, and we're going to talk more about that split next week, where the Anglo-Irish Treaty, it does set up a semi-independent Ireland, but at the cost of national unity, and that is the drawing line for many factions within the Irish Republican cause. Ultimately, the treaty ends up being signed in the in January of 1922, and it does go into effect. British troops remain in their garrisons until the spring of that year. They slowly start withdrawing from the garrisons. They disband the Black and Tans and the Irish Royal Constabulary, and the last British troops leave Ireland by December of 1922, at least in the Free State of Ireland. And that is the end to the Irish War for Independence, but that's going to transition because although semi-independence has been achieved through guerrilla warfare, that's essentially what this was a big, long guerrilla warfare campaign against British authority, British rule, and British military forces in Ireland. Although it achieves a very limited semi-independence, it ultimately fractures the people that were working to get it done. And that is going to be the tragic phase of this, is it's going to split the independent founding people of the Irish Republic. And in many ways, I mean, if you really think about it, that'd be very similar to, let's say, here in the United States, after we beat the British, that Britain insisted that, let's say, the southern colonies had still been loyal to Britain, because there was quite a few loyalists in the southern 13 colonies. Let's say that at the end of the American Revolution, that Britain said, yeah, but we're going to keep the other colonies because they get to stay with us. That probably would have enraged the American nation. And at the same time, it's also like the British having put in our Treaty of Independence that, yeah, you can be your own independent thing, but the President of the United States still has to kiss the boot of the British king. Yeah, that ain't happening either. But that's essentially what some of these Irish Republican figures felt had been handed to them, was Britain was willing to give independence, but they felt like Britain was still enforcing its terms, and they had come to the conclusion, if we have to, we'll fight more. We will get this full-on independence that we want and desire. We'll go to war again to make Britain see that we are sick of this. And that's going to lead into next week. But largely, it's a large guerrilla war campaign, but surprisingly, it works. It's not a full-on military rebellion. I think that's what the Irish had learned since 1798, was they learned that in 1798, when they tried a full-scale military uprising with common military warfare against the British, it was a losing game. But they learned rather quickly that when the British Army when any regular army is faced with guerrilla warfare, they don't They don't tend to fare as well as as a regular military force would. And they kind of picked that up, I think, since 1798, because this is a much different. 1798, it's regular warfare in most cases, where in 1919 through 1921, it turns into a hit-and-run campaign with units operating semi-independently by themselves under the same leadership generally, but loosely kind of connected, so they can operate pretty independently and make their hit-and-run tactics on the British, who the British have to wait for orders to come down from on high and can't operate as freely. And they don't know how to respond to this, I feel. So I feel that that was one lesson that comes about from 1798, was we know the British, we will never get them in full-on warfare. What about a hit-and-run war? And I think that obviously did work. I mean, Britain ultimately, they didn't want to admit defeat, but Britain was admitting defeat by signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And although the Irish didn't get everything they wanted, I mean, it was technically a win for them. They had beaten Britain because Britain had finally relinquished some of its control after, though not a military victory, I mean, they had technically beaten Britain by saying, yeah, you're never going to beat us. You've come against a foe you can't beat, so you're willing to cut your losses short instead of continuing them. But that covers for the Irish War for Independence. I just wanted to get that video a little in here. It can sometimes be a little complicated, and there's plenty of others out there. In fact, there's one good way you can really get a little bit immersed in the history of the Irish War for Independence. There is a plethora of Irish rebel songs that exist that are still played today and still used by many different musicians and bands around the world. And it's actually one of my favorite things to listen to in Irish music is these Irish rebel songs, because they can be very solemn and lamentful, and then you go to the next one and it's just like fiery and, in your face. And at the closing of this video here, I am going to put two links. Well, they'll show up on the recommendations here. of two different songs that come out of this period. The first one is that some people may be in. If you're familiar with any bit of Irish history, you may have heard these songs before, but the first one is the Foggy Dew, which kind of commemorates the 1916 Easter uprising that is kind of a predecessor to the Irish War for Independence. And it's more commonly an Irish lament or a ballad. It's much more mournful a lot of times than some of the other songs. It's kind of revering those fallen seven men and their followers who had fought for Irish independence in the Easter uprising, but had failed and then ended up being executed. So it is a lot more mournful. The second one has to deal with the Black and Tans that we dealt with, where it's literally called "Come Out, Ye Black and Tans," and it's a much more it's a faster paced, in your face song. I mean, at one point in the main chorus, they're even kind of commenting to the Black and Tans, "You think you're so tough? Well, come out here and show your wife how you got those medals down in Flanders in World War One. Come out here and show her how you got them. You didn't just get them for standing there, buddy. You got them for killing, but you're not going to tell your wife that. But come out, show her how you got those medals." At one point, I think they even make the reference of, you brag about facing the Arabs in World War One, but yet you fail to mention they had a bow and arrow, and you had a big old 16-pounder artillery cannon. So it's basically telling the Black and Tans, you're not so tough as you think you are, and we'll show you aren't. But I want to put those two songs at the end here just to kind of get some people so they can kind of see the difference between the two, but it's also dealing with this time period. And I mean, there's a whole plethora of these songs. If you end up liking those two, I encourage you, look up other types of Irish rebel songs. There is an immense library of available ones out there, and some of them are high-pitched, other ones are lamentful, some are fast, some are slow. Just depends on what the writer or the creator at the time thought when they were doing it. So I'm going to put those into the recommendations at the end of this video, so you can click on those and it'll take you to a good video that kind of plays through the song and has some background images and stuff like that plays through, I think, with the lyrics as well. So I'll put that in the end of the recommendations on this video. So I think that concludes it for this week. So as always, questions or comments, I actually do see I had a couple on the last two videos. Some of them I probably do need to reply to, so I'm going to start working on that later this week here, and hopefully get any comments or replies to anyone that needed any. So I'm going to handle that this week. Next week, we will cover the Irish Civil War, and then the week after that, I'm deciding what I'm going to do yet. I don't know what video I'm going to talk about, but I do know that coming around Halloween, we're going to cover the Donner Party, and I also want to cover one on Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, who is the original inspiration for Dracula, the vampire. So I want those to kind of be our Halloween-themed videos so far for this year. We might have a third one if I can't think of nothing else that one week, but we'll see what comes up when that happens. So that concludes it for this week. So hopefully everybody continues to do well. Any comments or questions, be sure to leave them. And we'll hopefully see you all back here next week for the final Irish video on the Irish Civil War.